Garveyites, 136 years after this parish gave birth to the greatest black man of the 20th century, the first national hero of this country. We call him Mowalimu because that means teacher Mowalimu Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And before I continue, let me first of all congratulate IRI FM. 3 decades of celebrating our founder, our first national hero. I would like you to give them a round of applause. You're too quiet. IRI FM, big up yourself. Kabu, big up yourself. Mota, big up yourself. The spirit of Mr. Young and everybody who makes this possible every year. This is a serious topic. And this is a topic that for too long Pan-Africanists and Garveyites in this country have shied away from. Politics or politricks. We walk wide of it. But today we are talking about whether the Republic putting ourselves in charge of ourselves. So we have to go in it. And we can never forget that it was our first national hero who formed the first modern political party in this country in 1929. I heard some of the speakers mention that earlier. And for the Rastas in the house, I want to remind you that in 1931, Emperor Haile Selassie I became the first monarch to, of his own will, grant his people a constitution and say that it was time for the people of Ethiopia to participate in the politics of the empire. So we don't have any excuses. We talk about the Jamaican constitution, we talk about the Jamaican parliament being 61 years old. But that's not true. A speaker earlier asked you when did we get adult suffrage? That was in 1944. But Marcus Garvey formed the first political party in 1929. The first black man entered the legislature of Jamaica in 1899. I would ask you, what is his name? I doubt anybody could tell me. Because we do not celebrate black history the way that we should to empower ourselves. If I ask you about William Wilberforce and Granville Sharp and this pit and that pit, you know these names. Alexander Dixon, the first black man to become a member of the Legislative Council of Jamaica. But let's go back even further than that. Jamaica has had a constitution and a national assembly from as early as 1664. It consisted of, at that time, 22 parishes, 2 representatives from each parish. And for 200 years almost, that parliament consisted of the plantation owners, the enslavers of our ancestors, the rapers of our grandparents and our grandmothers, those who trafficked and enslaved and put into chattel the people responsible for our existence today. So this process of taking charge of ourselves has been a long road, and we must honor the ancestors who contributed to tearing down those walls of white supremacy. And I know sometimes we get disgusted because we feel that some of our own black-skinned brothers who have entered that arena have been poisoned by that white supremacy. But we cannot absolve ourselves of responsibility. Garveyites, we've walked away from the political arena for too long. Between 1664 right up to emancipation in 1834, you had no black people providing representation in this country. The emancipations of Africans then began to allow for the proliferation of black people into our parliament, but it was not easy. because they set up many barriers. We didn't have a one-man, one-vote system until 1944. You had to be a property owner, maybe a plantation owner. You had to be paying taxes of a certain amount in order to exercise your franchise of suffrage. And that went on until a few half-black, half-white legislators began to creep into the parliament. One of them in particular entered the parliament in 1844 representing the parish of St. Elizabeth. They thought that as a colored, as they called them then, legislator, that he would side with the other planters and continue to produce laws that would oppress the masses of the people. But this young man was raised by his African mother. And he wasn't recognized or legitimized by his father until he turned 12 years old. When he went to the parliament, he went with the experience of what it was to grow up as a black Jamaican. And he fought for the rights of black Jamaicans, so much so that after serving one term, the other legislators conspired to make sure that he wasn't returned to the Legislative Council. The young man's name was George William Gordon. He stayed out of the Legislative Council for almost a decade, but in that decade, he strengthened his resolve to empower black people. He left the Anglican Church and joined the Native Baptist Church that was the black church at that time. He moved from St. Elizabeth to St. Thomas, which is the heart of Afrocentricity in this country even till today. And what he did frightened the legislator. He began to take tracts of land and cut them up and issue them to black people to pay their property taxes for them to overcome the hurdle of empowering them to be able to vote. In fact, I would say he created the first political garrison in this house, in this country, in St. Thomas. But it wasn't a garrison following petty party politics. It was a garrison of black people who were empowering themselves financially and politically to take charge of this country. And it frightened the legislature so much that not only did they execute this man, the first member of our parliament to be executed by the state, unlawfully, and full of conspiracies, if you know the history of George William Gordon. But they didn't stop there. When they realized that because black people had now freedom from emancipation, that they were beginning to empower themselves financially and that they could not hold back the tidal wave of black people coming to take over, to take charge of ourselves, to take control of the politics of this country, the British suspended our Legislative Council for 20 years. Now I know I'm going way back, but what Marcus Garvey said, people without knowledge of their past and history is like a tree without roots. And I need you to dig down and plant deep on this topic here. We're talking about constitutional reform, but most of the jargon I hear coming out of the politicians today is not addressing the real issues in the Constitution that need to be reformed. And I wonder if it is because we lack this knowledge of our history, of this battle that has been going on for over 300 years for black people to empower themselves in this country. After the Morant Bay uprising, Britain suspended self-governance in this country, 20 years. When they decided to reconstitute a National Assembly, they still couldn't hold back black people. So after we got back self-governance in 1885, the first black man entered the Legislative Council in 1899. By 1920, by 1917, when a young barrister by the name of James Alexander George Smith, they called him Jags, who was probably primarily the most important legislator when it came to creating that constitution that empowered black people with one man, one vote in 1944. He entered the legislature to represent the parish of Clarendon in 1917. But by 1917, you had a majority of black people in that legislative council. But we have two houses in our parliament, correct? They call one the lower house, and they call one the upper house. The lower house is the one that they started to let black people into. The upper house consisted of the governor's appointees, them same old plantocracy class. And they said that in order for you to pass laws, the laws that the lower house wanted to pass had to be sent to the upper house to be effected into law. I'm showing you how the politics change over the generations, but how they kept control. We have to understand the political machinery. So they empower us to make laws, but they put a check in there, in fact, that these laws have to pass through their hands. We still have two houses in the parliament. One called the lower house, where you elect your member of parliament, and another one called the upper house, which consists of senators. Do we elect people to the Senate? The Senate allows for the two political parties, the majority, to appoint 13 senators, and the minority party to appoint 8 senators. But they still have to sanction every law that comes up from the lower house. So you want to give black people power, but you still want to hold it back. By 1944, when we got adult suffrage, and it was one man, one vote, this was the same era that the political parties sprung up. The PNP in 1938, the JLP in 1943. And by 1962, when we got independence, there was not one single independent member of the House left. Or if there was, they didn't last until the next election in 1967. In 1944, when we had adult suffrage, you had a handful of independent members in the parliament. That was gobbled up by the political parties, by independents. Now, don't get me wrong. You cannot stop legislators from practicing collective security. You are always going to have political parties being formed in the political arena. But when we turned our backs as Pan-Africanists about putting into the legislature Pan-Africanists, we surrendered that power to the political parties who now act as our proxy. So whereas before in the 17th and 18th century, the governor appointed by the Queen used to appoint the legislative council, now we have the political parties appointing the upper house of the Senate. Where am I going with all of this? We are talking about reforming our constitution. And they give it to us as if it is just the simple issue of getting rid of the Queen. Between 1885, 1944, 1962, every time the constitution changed, our focus as a people was to change the constitution to empower the people. So after emancipation, we allowed for black people who could afford it to vote. Coming up to suffrage in 44, we allowed for all black people to vote. 1962, it was about independence, and we are now taking control. There would no longer be a governor appointed. It would be a governor general, right, who was selected by the political parties. Right? Now when we reform the constitution, we have to look at it deeper than just the issue of getting rid of the Queen. We have to balance the political culture of this country with the constitutional reforms that we make. For example, it is no secret that Jamaicans are invested in their political personalities. They want to select their head of government, their head of state. But since adult suffrage and even since independence, at no point at all have Jamaicans been empowered to select their head of the state. None of you chose Andrew Holness for Prime Minister. Don't deceive yourself. The Prime Minister is selected by the legislators. And so the party with the majority of legislators choose the Prime Minister, who is usually the leader of the party. And the leader of the party is selected by a couple thousand delegates of the party. So you have surrendered power to the political parties who choose your head of state and head of government for you. If you're going to reform the Constitution, that is the first thing that we need to reform. So it is not enough to say we want to get rid of the Queen and then allow the political parties to choose who becomes the president. We know that every Jamaican would like a say in who would be elected as president for this country. And you have to make your voices heard. Then they are talking about whether we're going to have a ceremonial president or an executive president. If the people are voting for a president, then what is the point of having a ceremonial president? Who wants to vote for something that is ceremonial? So it is a given that if you're going to give people suffrage on the choice of the head of state, then it must be an executive president that they are electing. But we cannot stop there. There are some other things in the Constitution that we know because of party politics have gone wrong. There are constituencies in this country where you will hear people say any dog in a green shirt can win that seat. Any puss in an orange shirt can win that seat. True or false? You want a dog or a puss in parliament to represent you? Your member of parliament is your representative to the national legislator. The culture in this country has to change, where you're not talking about how much your MP is going to give you for back to school and how much money you need from them to bury your granny. Your MP should be coming to you and saying, this is what we're voting on in parliament. As my constituents, how do you want me to vote? And that is how we are going to increase our role in taking charge of ourselves. So the next thing that we have to address in the parliament is the fact that MPs cannot be ministers. If their job is to represent their constituency, then why are people going into parliament to become ministers when you can't find them half the time that you have issues to deal with in your constituency? If we're talking about going to a republic, we have to be real about talking about separation of powers. And if you're elected as an MP and paid by the state to be an MP, then your job is to be an MP, not to be a minister of foreign affairs who's flying all over the country 8-10 months out of the year. So again, one more point I want to make before I go. I know some of us are not comfortable with politics in this country. We're not comfortable about talking about politics, and we're not interested in getting involved in the political process. But as long as we do that, we have allowed ourselves to be ruled by a minority of the people in this country. 30% was the voter turnout last election. 30% of the population are the ones who are deciding decisions that affect the 100% of us. Whose fault is that? You can't blame them and the party politics that they're invested in. You have to blame yourself and what you have divested yourself of in terms of political power. And you have to reclaim that political power. We don't want a queen. We want a president that is not selected by the political parties but elected by the people, because all power comes from the people. If we're going to elect a president, and if he's not going to appoint members of parliament to be his ministers, Then the final thing we have to address in reforming this constitution is that upper house of parliament where the white supremacy has lingered for so many years. That house that started out as the governor's vanguard to prevent the masses from realizing true political power. So I want you to go back to the Constitutional Reform Committee and tell them, it is not about just getting rid of the Queen. It's about electing our president, and it is about electing our senators. There is no reason why political parties should be appointing prime ministers and appointing senators for a people who are politically mature 61 years into independence. You see, some of the politicians are comfortable thinking that the masses are uneducated, that the masses don't understand this politics thing, so just empower us and we will make the decisions for you. But that is no different than how the planters thought in 1664. You couldn't allow your black chattel property enslaved Africans to make political decisions. These things were too important. We can't accept the same kind of system. Not in 2023. We have to demand proper representation and proper elective power for the people. When you go to your ballot, it's not just one X you can put on it. You can put an X on who you want to be president. You can put an X on who you want to be an MP. You can put an X beside who you want to be a senator. It's not going to confuse you. It's not going to discombobulate you. Anybody who don't know says black people build the pyramids and, as Marcus Garvey said, reduce the heavenly constellations to minute and regular calculus. Don't know their history. So don't tell me about black people being uneducated and unintelligent when we invented the maths and the arts and the sciences. It's in our DNA. It's in our blood. Now, this is a hard topic to talk about, particularly amongst this crowd. And I know we like feel-good talks, feel-good music, feel-good poems. But they're moving this thing. And if you don't signal which way you want the train to go and demand how you want the tracks to be laid, we're going to be left behind. Remember what I said to you here today. Black people have fought tooth and nails to tear down the walls of political power that insulated the colonizers who oppressed our ancestors. And we pulled it down brick by brick by brick. But we're not finished yet. We cannot walk away from this construction site. We have to engage. And we have to engage with a clear message. We want an elected president, an executive president, and we want a separation of powers between the executive and the members of parliament, and we want the ability to elect our senators. Only then will we lay down a roadmap to truly empower the masses and give power to the people. All power to the people. One God.
One aim. One destiny.